of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, August 10th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Sara Marcus, author of Political Disappointment, A Cultural History from Reconstruction to the AIDS Crisis. And later in the show, Zoya Teirstein, staff writer at Grist magazine, will be with us to discuss the rise in climate change-related disease. Meanwhile, new ProPublica report shows Clarence Thomas had a bunch of sugar daddies. Not just Harlan Crow, he's got an oil baron, the blockbuster billionaire, all sending him on yachts and jets into luxury sports suites, all undisclosed. Fulton County DA to seek dozens of indictments in her election probe of Trump, among others. Jack Smith reportedly executed a search warrant for Trump's Twitter some months back, and Elon Musk was fined for a delay in complying, but they did in the end. I want to see those DMs, Trump's DMs. Meanwhile, Trump says he won't sign the loyalty pledge required for the first debate, so he won't show probably. Biden to seek an additional $25 billion for Ukraine. Death toll rises in the Maui wildfires. It's up to 36 now. Thousands of food service workers to rally today in Las Vegas ahead of a potential strike. Right-wing Ecuador presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio assassinated at the campaign rally 2 weeks before the election. Did I get that right? Vicencio. There we go. The Intercept has a report showing that the State Department encouraged the Pakistani government to remove Imran Khan back in 2022. More anti-trans insanity in Florida. Orange County Public Schools to require parental permission for nicknames. A Utah man who threatened to assassinate Biden, killed in a standoff with the FBI. Dianne Feinstein hospitalized after a fall in San Francisco. And lastly, Republican donor Tony Lazzaro, sentenced to 21 years in prison over sex trafficking minors. Was he the guy?
He was deep state watchdog Tucker Carlson's source for the Ilhan Omar
brother
married
story.
her brother thing. So.
Story. All this and more on today's program. God.
Lazzaro, I forget the name of the university in Minnesota. It might be St. Thomas. Was charged alongside a leader of the Young Republicans group there who helped him groom young girls.
Is it trite to continue talking about projection?
Sound of freedom, baby.
Oh my God. I saw Odell Beckham Jr. tweeted, loved Sound of Freedom or something. I'm really having a hard... He was one of my last holdouts. I mean... I gotta say, I'm enjoying Aaron Rodgers very much on Hard Knocks. He's cool. It's hard not, but except for all the anti-vax stuff. It's just like, never look to your favorite athletes for good politics. Yeah. Even when you think they'll have good politics based on their personality, then you realize, oh wait, you don't know anything about their personality.
Based on the way you throw a tight spiral 40 yards down the field, I thought you were a lefty.
Oh, it's just, that's maybe just my wires getting crossed in my brain. Speaking of Minnesota, though, I wanted to highlight this story if we could. This was in Bloomberg, and they overemphasize free market forces, but the information in here is still really good, and I wanted to read this to you guys. No place in the U.S. has put inflation in the rearview mirror quite as fast as Minneapolis. Now, I'm more focused on like general cost of living increases going down and people being able to afford things like housing and healthcare, but inflation going down because of affordable housing initiatives is indicative of larger indicators that I think are important to point out. In May, the Twin Cities became the first major metropolitan area to see annual inflation fall below the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. Its 1.8% pace of price increases was the lowest of any region that month. That's largely due to a region-wide push to address one of the most intractable issues for both the Fed and American consumers, rising housing costs. We've talked about this on the show before, how while wages are increasing, it's not increasing at the same rate as things like housing and rent. In Minneapolis, though, they're starting to at least come up with some solutions that are working. Well before pandemic-related supply chain snarls and labor shortages roiled the economy, the city of Minneapolis eliminated zoning that allowed only single-family homes, and since 2018 has invested $320 million for rental assistance and subsidies. That helped unleash a boom in construction of apartments and condos in the region that proved to be a powerful antidote against inflation, given that the cost of shelter accounts for more than a third of the overall U.S. Consumer Price Index. Minneapolis shelter prices were up at half of the nation's annual pace in May. And then you can see here at this chart right below, you see how Minneapolis metro residents spend lower share of income on rent compared to other comparable cities. The housing initiatives, including the Ithaca project, an alliance of the business, philanthropic, and public sectors in the region pushing for at least 18,000 new housing units per year through 2030, have picked up where the Fed's monetary tightening leaves off, demonstrating the role state and local policies can play in curbing inflation. They also show how a regional economy can get a boost when politicians are able to temper opposition to new building, sometimes part of the Not in My Backyard or NIMBY movement. Local backlash has squashed projects from California to New York, where an ambitious plan by Governor Kathy Hochul to add about 800,000 units of housing over the next decade fell apart in April after resistance from suburban areas. Rent growth in Minneapolis since 2017 is just 1%, compared with 31% in the U.S. overall, according to the Pew Charitable Trust. Its share of affordable rental units and ratio of rent to income are better than most comparable U.S. metro areas. You can see in that graph below how much smaller the rent increases have been compared to other parts of the country, compared to the U.S. overall. This is just one of the approaches. If we scroll down to the part that starts with Curry Commons. Curry Commons is an 187-unit complex under construction in the Harrison neighborhood of North Minneapolis, where the poverty rate exceeds 30%. A quarter of the apartments will be reserved for those making less than 30% of area median income, or $35,500 for a family of four. The four-story property will include a roof deck with a view of the city skyline and blah, blah, blah. So that's a mixed housing initiative, which has proven to be in other experimentations, both not in the United States and in the United States, a pretty promising way forward to make sure that housing is more affordable. I think that we need more public housing in order to further tamp down rental properties, or rental prices, I should say. And some advocates also point to the fact that in Minneapolis, they also repealed the mandatory parking minimums for some of these developments, which basically allowed for a bunch of different projects to get greenlit because they didn't require all of the housing that would be necessary for a certain amount of cars. Just an example, when you drive down housing, you drive down inflation, you make places more livable, housing prices, I should say, and there should be more done, but this should be happening in every major city in America right now.
Well, I mean, this is the thing that I think our system is I'm more readily able to do, but it's, I think, half of the story. Like Minnesota's put in $1 billion into housing, in the recently they passed a bill for that, and a lot of this is helping people pay rent, helping people pay down payments and stuff like that. And I think that's really good, but also like St. Paul has a rent control ordinance. We're going to need to see things like this, because ultimately, I think when you see this kind of money flood the system, unless you have things like rent control, ultimately you're going to see like relief for people like we did during COVID. But then you will see, I'm worried you will see inflation without this. And from the Sahan Journal, which covers the Muslim community in Minnesota, Minneapolis, this is from June 28th. This year, Minneapolis City Council kills rent control with 3 Muslim members absent for Eid. The 3 Muslim council members who missed Wednesday's meeting say their vote to stop rent control was inappropriate, purposeful, and exclusionary, and they were all pro rent control. Like, and I think like I think it's great that like this the yes in my backyard stuff I think is really good, but I worry about like. I don't think you can just do that, because I ultimately think like we're going to be, and I think like the St. Paul rent control stuff probably should be worth a mention too. Like that's keeping rent prices down in Minneapolis.
In the other parts of the state as well. I
mean, despite Minneapolis is getting, disemboweled.
And another quick story here before we get to our guest. Representative Joaquin Castro went to Eagle Pass, which is an area along the southern border in Texas. And he went and took a look at these barrel traps and buoys, the ones that are wrapped with barbed wire.
Razor
and
wire,
have killed... it's razor wire?
Yeah. It's like a saw. It's like saw on the border.
It's maimed pregnant women, or at least one pregnant woman. If it's killed people.
Yep.
And in a tweet in response to it, Greg Abbott said something, called them, the bodies that drowned. No, they were people that drowned. People that were maimed by razor wire and drowned to death because of these barrel traps that are being placed in the Rio Grande so that they have to go to deeper areas of the water and are more likely to be intercepted along the border. This is, I guess, an area that had been traditionally easier to cross through, but now there's like death traps that are submerged and that are killing people. So Castro went down there, and this is his video showing the insane barbarity at play here.
Know that there's been a lot of controversy about these barrel traps that are being placed by Governor Abbott in the Rio Grande and what exactly they're doing, and the state says that they're not a danger to anybody. Well, I want you to look right here at this chainsaw type device they have right in the middle of these buoys, and then if you come right over here, you can see in the distance the razor wire, all that razor wire right against the river. So you really have a situation where the state government and Greg Abbott are treating human beings like animals. These are folks who are asylum seekers who try to petition for asylum in the United States. And this is how the men, women, and children, what they're seeing here when they try to present for asylum. It's incredibly dangerous, incredibly inhumane, and it's the reason that I've said that it's barbaric, because it is. You see that go all along there. People are getting stuck. There was a dead body that was stuck to this last week. Reports of a child that died. If you go closer to this razor wire, there's people's clothing that has been stuck to the wire because they've gotten stuck in that wire. And the state troopers, even if when they see families with a baby, with a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, they won't help the family if they're stuck in that wire. So it's incredibly inhumane, and that's why we're out here. Operation Lone Star has also been devastating to the border community. They've seized private property. This is supposed to be a public park. You can see that they've taken it over for their operation, so the public can't really use it much anymore. So it's gotten very dangerous, not just for the migrants, The state troopers have now cut off CBP from doing its job. They're very much interfering with the work that CBP is responsible for, and then it's dangerous for the community as well.
What he's referring to at the end there is that Customs and Border Patrol is, supposedly federal agency, right? Not supposedly, it's supposed to be. And Abbott has been superseding the federal government's authority by doing this. It's in part a race to be more barbaric than DeSantis, I guess. Like these two big state Republican governors competing on a national stage as to who can provide the most blood or hatred for a national right-wing audience. But it's just crazy to me that Biden hasn't been more, I think, aggressive from a Department of Justice perspective on this, because this is not Abbott's authority. This is the federal government's authority.
Biden, or even just float like, hey, the Hague, the International Criminal Court is going, like, he should, if we were serious about like the West and our institutions, and Abbott would be going to the Hague.
Yeah. The problem though is that Biden has now one of his like worst
Send
qualities.
A lawyer down there.
What'd you say?
I was going to say, we'll send a lawyer down there.
Yeah, sure. Right, they'll draft a memo. One of his worst qualities, and I think in many ways Biden has exceeded some of my expectations, but where he has been a real failure, in my opinion, is in his complete cowardice about the border. He is terrified of being called soft on the border, so much so that he extended Title 42. He tried to keep a lot of those draconian anti-asylum seeker measures in place. And he's not standing up to a governor who's essentially giving him the middle finger and saying, no, this is my border and I'm going to maim migrants and asylum seekers at my disposal and whenever I want to. So this is a failure of Merrick Garland. It's a failure of Biden to not be more aggressive on this front. And I really wish that he would use the office of the presidency, the bully pulpit at the very least, to call this out, let alone threaten Abbott with legal action. All right, guys, going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Sara Marcus. We are back, and we are joined now by Sara Marcus, professor of English at Notre Dame, author of Political Disappointment, A Cultural History from Reconstruction to the AIDS Crisis. Sara, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me on.
So your book, it looks at really these kind of 5 moments in the 20th century-ish. I know you start talking about Reconstruction, and we'll get into that. But these moments where windows were open for more radical change in activism, but then were quickly closed by forces of systemic racism, of capitalism, whatever it may be. And then you talk about the art and the expression that comes from, that comes in the wake of those disappointments. Can you describe what those moments of political disappointment look like, and why you chose to focus on this concept of disappointment through this like historical and sociological lens?
Thanks so much. So the 5 moments in the 20th century that my book deals with are, as you said, it begins with the aftermath of Reconstruction, which I argue actually sets into motion a new importance for disappointment in the cultural history of the United States, since Reconstruction can be seen as this opportunity that doesn't pan out to fully remake the United States as a multiracial democracy. And as we all know, it doesn't actually turn out that way. But the fact that had been attainable, that it had actually been underway, the Constitution was amended, and the makeup of who was in the legislative bodies changed. And then it all got rolled back, as we know. So this sets up a pattern that I see as recurring throughout the 20th century of these moments. So the second one is the 30s and the communist movement in US politics. The third one is the civil rights movement, and specifically this moment after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, when there's a disagreement about how to deal with the fact that racism and white supremacy have not in fact been obliterated through these legislative victories. The fourth moment is the feminist movement at the onset of the backlash, which actually gets going a few years before Reagan's presidency. I date it to 1977 and on. And then the fifth example that kind of closes out the book is the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. And I decided to approach these 5 moments through culture because that was where I saw the power and the force of the political desires that had just a moment before been motivating political work and activism that people could reasonably expect to bear fruit. Once those moments of possibility and actionability start to close off, I saw how people's passions and wishes and energies went into culture, went into literature, and sound was sort of the unexpected star player in the book. I sort of went into this book thinking it was going to be primarily a book about literature, and it was motivated by my love for 20th century writers like Grace Paley and Adrienne Rich, people who had lives and movements and were also celebrated writers who managed to write about what it was like to have political commitments in and out of season. But then sound came out as this, and music as this other really important element in what I was looking at. But so disappointment came out in these forms, and especially in these interesting details where things that were otherwise unexpressible could come out.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I think it was such a great touch how people, when they think about disappointment in the 20th century, I think they think about the end of the counterculture, the 1960s, the assassinations of JFK, then MLK, and shortly after that RFK. And that's a disappointment or a shock for the general population, right? That was shared, and that's the one I think people most associate with. If you're talking about disappointment in that era, that's what most people would come up with. But you choose to focus on not disappointments that were just felt by the general population or shocks like that, but ones for Black people, the feminist movement. And it's almost like this expansive notion of what politics mean for different groups, since they are sometimes not at the forefront, or not sometimes, often not at the forefront of our collective historical understanding.
Right. And that focus shift that you're talking about is actually what enables the story of the 20th century as it's usually been told and as we've received it, as the story of this set of successive expansions in who's included in the American project, who's included in the citizenry. And that's the story that I grew up learning. And it's with the vantage point of the 21st century, where the fissures that were present there all along start to crack and undermine the whole project, that we can realize how incomplete those expansions and inclusions were in the first place. And I say we, I don't mean, but my point is that in the 20th century, there were plenty of people who were aware of it at the time. There's this great quote from a memoir that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote. Looking back on his college years at the end of the 19th century, he writes that it was an age of progress with a capital P, and that everybody around him was like, yes, America's on the way up, everything's getting better. And he writes that if it hadn't been for his close association with and understanding of the situation of Black people in America at the time, he too would have been a worshiper of progress, and he would have bought this story that everything was getting better. But the truth can often be found in what are the experiences of the people who are being left out of whatever supposed advance is happening. And so the story is the same with respect to the narrative about the 60s as the 20th century's signal disappointment, and nothing was ever as disappointed as that, and it was just one long downward slide since then. That was the myth that I was trying to examine and get clear focus on in writing this book. Well, was it really just everything in the 20th century went upward toward the 60s, and then it was just like, down to the gutter since then. And it's not. It's actually a much more of a periodic and multiple cycles of aspiration and disappointment over the course of the century.
Let's start with that first one then, with Reconstruction, and you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois and some of his work there. What were some of the most poignant examples or striking moments of music, of art reflecting the pain felt in the wake of the failures of Reconstruction?
Du Bois's magnificent book, The Souls of Black Folk, ends with a chapter called Of the Sorrow Songs, in which he writes a sort of musicological, sociological, even historical account of the spirituals that Black people were singing in and since slavery. And he not only focuses on these in this last chapter of the book, but as he was putting together the various essays that made up Souls of Black Folk, many of which had been published in magazines before, he chose to excerpt short bits of musical transcriptions of spirituals to use as part of these two-part epigraphs to his book. So each essay is preceded by a poem in English or German, some sort of uncontested Euro-American high culture poetic text, paired with a few measures of transcribed spiritual, of music made up by African Americans under conditions of enslavement. And the argument there is, the musical work that Black people in America have done is equivalent to and on par with any other high culture text that you could think of. What's beautiful about the way he writes about the music in the end of his book is that he's writing about how it's important, not despite its link to, he's writing, of course, several decades after the end of slavery, at a time when, especially in Black colleges and universities, there was a lot of ambivalence about continuing to sing these songs because they're a vestige of the past and, we're trying to move beyond that. Why do we have to keep singing these? And Du Bois does this really radical thing of saying, it's precisely because of its link to the bad old days that it carries the seeds of a truly new and important expression that is going to sort of move the whole human race and the whole the sum total of like human cultural achievements forward. Like, it's our time as Black Americans, we have like the most important expression, and it's this music that comes from disappointment. He actually calls it, the music of disappointment, and gives it this central role in his masterpiece about how about the situation of Black people within America and the history of America itself.
Hey, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I'm curious how that informed your analysis as well, jumping a few decades later to the civil rights movement and some of the tensions there between, tactics and the real complex tapestry of different activists and people who had different ideas about how to achieve equality and how that gets so flattened historically, and MLK becomes like a saint, and then the rest of history gets put to the side. In your analysis of that work during that period, what did you take away from it most of all?
So the third chapter takes as its set piece this march that takes place over the state of Mississippi in the summer of 1966. And Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, the recently elected head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, are basically the co-leaders of this march. And there's tension there. There's some tension there because King, of course, represents the sort of classical civil rights, nonviolent approach. And Carmichael is more aligned with the way of thinking that's going to be known as Black Power. And in fact, it's on this march that Carmichael first introduces Black Power as a chant at rallies and on the march. And so what I thought was so interesting is that the press made a whole lot at this time of like, oh, there's this huge clash between, Martin Luther King, who's nonviolent, and Stokely Carmichael, who knows what this guy's going to do. He's so radical, and the movement's falling apart because they can't agree on whatever. The fact is, they worked together to lead this march forward, and it took place over the course of several weeks. And one of the places that their collaboration became really palpable is in the sound of the march. We all think about, there are so many articles now like, oh, the civil rights movement had such great music and our movements now don't have the same great music. Like, we need that. The civil rights movement is practically seen as synonymous with its soundtrack. The soundtrack of the march in 1966 was totally contested. Even King, writing about it in his book in 67, writes about, he dramatizes it, the conflict about tactics, as a conflict over whether to sing "We Shall Overcome." And he writes this scene in which the SNCC people are saying, we don't sing that song anymore. And there's also a conflict about what to chant, whether you go, what do we want? And people had said freedom, but now we have some people going, what do you want? Black power. And they're kind of having a fight against whose chant is going to be loudest. And King bans all the chants. He's like, you know what, let's just not do that chant. It's just turning into too much of a place of chaos and cacophony. So instead what you get is ambient sound coming up, silence, quiet, and what King in a speech later that summer calls the tramp, tramp, tramp of marching feet.
Yeah, I mean, that's even in that snippet, right? You see some of the central solidarity, the planning, the strategy, and then how activism is inherently involves internal conflict. But that gets played up in order to discredit. Exactly. And that still holds true to this day, for sure. Another fascinating piece of history that you talk about in your book, which we've mentioned here on the show, but I think is important to emphasize, is the communist movement of the 1930s and how New Deal style politics. There were critics on the left that felt that it did not go far enough. And what did you find in your when you looked into that period of history, and some of the art and the vocals that came out of that period?
So my discussion of the history of communist and communist-affiliated fellow traveler culture in the 30s focuses on this shift, maybe kind of a obscure, nitpicky to those of us looking backward, shift in communist ideology in the mid-30s from third period ideology, which in brief just said the revolution is around the corner, we just have to get all our ducks in a row, it's coming down right now. And then almost on a dime, they shifted to be actually, we need to build broad coalitions with liberals and socialists, all of which had been really off limits before, because the important thing is to fight fascism. And that's our most important thing. And I would never argue that fighting against fascism is not a good priority to have. But the key is that people never talk about the fact that there were losses entailed in that shift. Well, people never talk about it. Robin D.G. Kelly writes about it in his book Hammer and Hoe, how one of the effects of that shift was that what had been the communists' really bedrock commitment to racial justice and to empowering Black workers and centering the struggle against racism in the fight for communism, this got pretty sidelined to the point where some Communist Party chapters were making coalitions with white supremacists and Klan members, because that was who the liberals were in that area at that time. So that's one loss, is the sort of loss of a really sharp line around racism. And the other one is, I found writing by people saying, when we lost the horizon of imminent revolution, it was really hard to get our bearings after that. We didn't know where to go, and in fact, somebody writes specifically in an essay about how it was difficult for writers and artists who had been yeah, we're making revolutionary art. And then that gets taken away and people are what are we doing? And I see that happening in the case of this writer, Tilly Olson, who became pretty well known with her book, Tell Me a Riddle, which won the O. Henry Award in 1960, and then well known again about 20 years later with a feminist book called Silences. But she had been a kind of star of the proletarian literature movement in the early 30s, and she was like really sure that revolution was about to come. And when that shift occurred, she was unable to finish her novel and basically didn't write anything for several decades. So I was just very interested in, not in saying that, you know, the Popular Front was a bad idea or that there shouldn't have been coalitions to fight fascism, but thinking about the trade-offs that happen when political approaches change.
It's also what's striking about, like, I think looking at activism in the wake of disappointment as well is how we can learn a lesson in this current moment right now.
Absolutely.
I mean, right now we run a podcast that's on the left, right? A show that's on the left, and there's a lot of energy sapped right now in the wake of the Bernie Sanders movement, electorally, I would say, and Biden being the nominee without really any opposition. There's this kind of moment of that we're drudging through right now. I would say that that's part of what's useful about your book, for people to historicize what we're currently going through. I would say your other chapter on feminism hit close to home because second wave feminism, essentially, there was this moment of liberation, of jubilance, but it was inherently exclusionary in many ways as well. It's what we now know in some circles as white feminism, but it opened lanes for intersectional feminist thought, which you mentioned Audre Lorde at the start of this interview. What was some of what you found in looking at this period in the late 1970s and early 80s?
In the late 70s and early 80s, when backlash started to hit second wave feminism, and a lot of the gains that had been achieved over the course of the 70s started being rolled back, attacked, and undermined. For example, the first Supreme Court case under chipping away at Roe v. Wade actually happens in 1977, just a few years after the original court decision. In addition, there are ballot initiatives being proposed and passing in some cases in Florida and in California in 77 as well. So it's under these conditions of mounting backlash, mounting opposition. In addition, right-wing women are getting organized under the leadership of Phyllis Schlafly to challenge even the most centrist, unobjectionable formulation of women's empowerment. It's during this time that you start to see, I guess we could say, white feminists. I mean, there can be something a little bit too reductive about just being like, oh yeah, that's white feminism. But in this case, sure, majority white or white predominated feminist circles start to recognize that they're having a common conversation with feminists of color who have been, articulating the exclusion and the overly narrow conception of like womanhood and what feminism could mean for several years at that point. But it's right around the late 70s and early 80s that you start to see people understanding themselves as engaged in a common conversation. And so I pinpoint that in a couple of instances, and one of them is in this pair of poems written by Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich, sort of talking to each other about images and the power of representation, and where Adrienne Rich puts forth this sort of basic anti-porn feminist line, which was pretty much the mainstream radical feminist line in the early 80s in a poem called The Images. And Audre Lorde kind of comes back with this incredible poem called After Images, which is in large part about images of Emmett Till after his lynching, and about a power to see what I call seeing historically in the book, to superimpose images from history on images of the present, as a way of sort of transforming the meanings of history and the meanings of these images, instead of just being like, these images are oppressing me so badly, to be like, if this is what's available in my world, if this is what's available in my image world, like, what am I able to accomplish by zooming out, thinking about history in a more comprehensive way, and putting things together that nobody else is going to put together for me.
Lastly, here before I let you go, I just wanted to make sure we touched on the AIDS crisis element of your book, because this is I know there's been some great documentaries. I'm blanking on the name of How to Survive a Plague is one of the great but we need a real cultural reckoning with what the barbarity of the AIDS crisis, the lack of humanity shown, but you show some of the beauty that came from this horrific awful plague, basically, for many gay Americans in this country, showing the sense of community that forged and the art that came from it. If you don't mind touching on that briefly before we run out of time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One thing is, the documentary I would recommend to all your viewers is called United in Anger, and it's a documentary specifically about ACT UP. I teach it all the time. And what I love about this documentary is that it shows how the disappointment of the AIDS crisis, and of realizing that, with all the gains made post-Stonewall, that queer lives were still very undervalued in this country. But that sense of disappointment became a grounds for solidarity, and not just within queer Americans, but also for people who were being affected by the AIDS crisis for reasons of drug use, race, class, and people were able to come together through ACT UP and other coalitions to really fight back and make a difference on that epidemic.
Well, fascinating stuff. Great book. I would highly recommend it. Sara Marcus, professor of English at Notre Dame, and the book is called Political Disappointment: A Cultural History from Reconstruction to the AIDS Crisis. We'll put a link in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much, Sara.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. All right, guys, quick break. And when we come back, we will be talking about the diseases coming from climate change with Zoya Teirstein of Grist magazine. Be right back. We are back, and we are joined now by Zoya Teirstein, staff writer at Grist magazine, whose piece is entitled "From Samoa to the East Coast, Doctors Are Diagnosing and Treating Climate Change." Zoya, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to play this really quickly for you and just get your reaction. Grist, by the way, does great work on climate change, and everyone should read their reporting over there. In Maui, these wildfires have been absolutely devastating. Dozens dead already. The death count is still climbing. But this was some of the footage a Twitter user posted. It's footage from Lahaina in Hawaii after the wildfires just wreaked havoc over the island. Here we go. I mean, that just looks like, it almost looks like a war zone. Yeah. It's just absolutely terrifying that so many of these extreme events are going to continue to happen. And communities like like that are going to be deeply affected. I mean, we're seeing more and more of this, obviously, Zoya. Your reactions to yet another climate disaster that we're seeing around the country.
Yeah, it's been a summer of extremes, which is putting it lightly. My colleague Anita Hofschneider wrote about this, published a piece this morning on Grist about, she's based in Hawaii, and she covers Indigenous communities there. She's on our Indigenous Affairs team, and she wrote this heartbreaking story about a mother in California who's used to wildfires, trying to track down her son who lives in Maui. And yeah, so yeah, I mean, there's really not, I think journalists are a little taken aback this summer by what's going on. It's a lot.
Do you think that it's because journalists are sometimes based in New York, and what we experience here, it has to do with like when we had the air quality issues that came down from the California wildfires? I mean, that's a little bit reductive to say, oh, media based on the coast, now they're starting to pay attention. But you've covered the climate over at Grist for a long period of time. Are you beginning to see some sort of larger media reckoning with what everybody's experiencing?
Totally. And I think there's a delineation, right, between like climate media and regular media. I think in the climate world, people are pretty used to seeing this stuff, and, journalists are based all over. I am based in New York. But, I think that there are journalists whose work I've been reading everywhere across the U.S. this summer who are writing with this tone of, it's like a holy cow tone. Like, this is what we've been writing about and saying would happen for quite some time. And now it is. But yeah, I think that in terms of like a reckoning, for sure, I think wildfire smoke in New York City definitely got that message to ring out sort of loud and clear.
Yeah, it really is just, I think also once it's one thing to read scientific data and then to have the visual imagery in front of your face of the consequences. Once we've set off this chain reaction, that's a whole that kind of imagery, I think, does freak people out, even if there is somewhat of a deep sense of immobilization from some sectors where we're just going to do more electric vehicle subsidies and call it a day. That's just something that I think the tension that we're experiencing somewhat right now. But thinking of everybody over in Hawaii at this moment. Now I just wanted to turn to your piece here. Your piece begins in Samoa, and you talk about their experiences dealing with hurricanes and extreme events for years as a bit of a ground zero, really, for climate-related illness and what we can learn from them. Let's just start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Samoa is like on the front lines of climate change in so many ways, not just because of sea level rise, but also because they're in this seismic zone where they're prone to the cyclones and earthquakes, and so they're very much used to natural quote unquote disasters, which positions them well, doctors in that area, for what's coming and what is happening. I mean, we just referenced talking about what happened this summer, what is happening this summer. And I've written about that in the U.S. Doctors are struggling to figure out what to do. And I think, it has not really been written about in this way before, which is why I wanted to take this angle with this story. But there are folks on the front lines of climate change who have been on the front lines of climate change who have a ton to say about how to treat people, how to treat patients as, these impacts accelerate. And I think that not tapping into that sort of institutional knowledge over there is a mistake for folks in the U.S. I mean, I think there's an opportunity there. Whether that's a silo that can be taken down, I'm not sure.
I mean, do you think it's part of a larger kind of lack of curiosity about what people in the global South are experiencing when it comes to climate-related disasters and diseases? There seems to be a very Western-centric approach that a lot of people take when it comes to dealing with expertise or trying to get their hands on how to deal with some of the most acute effects of climate change.
Yeah, well, I think that there's, oftentimes when folks in the U.S. talk about the global South, it's a conversation about, what resources they need, how they're disadvantaged, how climate change has affected them first and foremost, and how they've contributed comparatively so little to the climate crisis. I mean, that's the great irony there, right? And that's all true. At the same time, what I wanted to highlight in this piece is that these doctors that I spoke to in Samoa have a ton of knowledge that that is like applicable, and they've created curriculum about, like, they've done so much to make this issue present and to incorporate it into their teaching there. So I think that awareness is an important thing for the West to realize too. It's like it's not just, of course people are suffering there, and it is difficult. And when a hurricane hits, I'm not going to say that the Samoan medical system is amazing. It's not. I mean, the physicians there told me that it's very, very, how do I describe it? I mean, they barely have enough doctors to go around. They lose one doctor, and the entire system is on the verge of collapse. However, there's a lot there that can also be pulled from. And so those two things together need to be, I think, balanced a little bit more in the way that we think about, the global south.
What are some of the diseases and illnesses that we're going to be seeing in the future, given the effects of climate change, the climate-driven illnesses that we know of, and even some that we may not know of?
Yeah, it's a topic that I've been covering for the past, I would say, 2+ years at Grist. And the more I cover it, the more fascinating and disturbing it gets. There are, of course, all the typical ways in which you might expect climate change to affect human health. You've got, for example, in Phoenix right now, ER is inundated with heat stroke, victims. But then you also have a number of unexpected impacts. Like, I interviewed this young, healthy man who is also a journalist, actually, and he went to help his mom dig out their basement after a wildfire out west in California. And he contracted a very strange illness after that trip. So he came back to where he lived on the East Coast, and he was experiencing weird symptoms. Felt like he'd been beaten all over the baseball bat. Felt like he was walking on knives when he took a step. And he went to the hospital. They took a scan of his lungs. They thought they had found cancer. They were about to take a biopsy. And then at the last second, like it was an episode of ER, a team of infectious disease specialists burst into his room and said, "Wait, we think you have a fungal-borne pathogen called valley fever. It's a disease that is growing increasingly common due to climate change in the arid Southwest and West." And so that's an example of a disease that's like, no one thinks of it. It's not a common thing for doctors in a lot of the country. So that's the kind of thing that I really want to highlight in this piece about doctors. It's like, people have knowledge based on where they are. Are they sharing it with each other?
Well, I mean, the migratory element of some of these illnesses, that kind of coordination is going to be needed. Can you explain why there would be this kind of resurgence or the appearance of fungi, of diseases that would not be traditionally native to certain populations or areas? Why climate change affects the proclivity of that kind of those newer diagnoses?
Yeah, I'll use dengue fever as an example because it's a good sort of way to look at the way that climate change affects many different diseases. But basically, climate change affects the range and the elevation at which insects, other animals, fungal pathogens even exist. So mosquitoes like Aedes aegypti, which carries dengue fever, which is spreading in many parts of the world, can move into new elevations, like in Nepal, for example, where historically it'd be much too cold for that mosquito to survive. Now it has no problem, setting down roots there, as it were. And then in addition to that, with that same mosquito, when it's warmer out, even where it already exists, it can lay more eggs, it can breed more easily, it finds better environments to sort of breed and hang out in. Even when it gets too hot for mosquitoes, I learned this yesterday by talking to a specialist, even when it gets too hot for those mosquitoes, because there is a threshold at which mosquitoes can't survive anymore, they hide under couch cushions, they lurk in little shadowy places. So mosquitoes are annoyingly good at surviving. And the same can be said for so many ticks, for example, fungal pathogens. These things have a way of persisting despite the odds. And I think that, humans in all over the world are not prepared for what that means for our health.
Yeah, and what happens too when these things grow in areas that may not have great sanitation systems or plumbing systems are a little bit threadbare. That I would imagine that in those areas, that's what we talk about when it comes to, say, like environmental racism. There's going to be more. There's going to be more of these kinds of diseases that spread, I would guess.
Yeah, I think cholera is a good example of that, a bacteria that causes great intestinal, digestional discomfort. And it basically causes vomiting, diarrhea, all sorts of impacts, especially in young children. Young children die from this disease often. And what happens with cholera is, for example, in Pakistan, when there are major floods, open sanitation systems that are not super clean and that are sometimes overflowing will spread into nearby areas, and so that will infect nearby waterways and drinking water supplies with that bacteria and spread that illness. So there's the opposite effect too, where when there's less water to go around during drought, climate-driven drought is becoming a more prevalent thing. People will clamp down on their water supplies and will use less to wash their hands, et cetera, and will spread bacteria that way. So yeah, I mean, I think that the bacteria and waterborne illnesses issue is very prevalent, particularly in countries that have poor sanitation systems.
You mentioned Phoenix earlier. Naturally, I think that the health effects of extreme heat are going to be the ones that come to people's mind first, right? Heat stroke and things like that. I mean, what has it been like in Phoenix with record-breaking temperatures? I know that there have been deaths, but the amount of extreme heat and how long it persisted, what were some of the effects of health-wise that you saw in your reporting?
Yeah, it's not just heat stroke, although it is a lot of heat stroke. ER doctors are overwhelmed. They're really feeling the effects this summer in terms of volume of patients and also severity of illness. So, like I said, it's not just heat stroke. It's a number of heat-related illnesses, including burns. I mean, that's been an especially disturbing piece of this whole thing in Phoenix. I mean, Phoenix experienced 31 back-to-back days of temperatures 110 degrees Fahrenheit or above, which is very, very hot. It's the hottest month on record in a U.S. city. And when it gets that hot, pavement gets really, really hot. Surfaces get really, really hot. So people are falling down, and even short contact with pavement results in second or third degree burns, doctors told me. So, their burn units are very, very busy. A doctor told me that a patient of hers, an elderly woman, fell in front of her home and couldn't get help for 2 hours. She arrived in the ER with horrible burns all over her body. So it's the way that climate change affects health in these both expected and unexpected ways. And those things conflate in really disorienting, ways. And that's hard for doctors, and it's hard for patients too.
Yeah, you cite a Lancet study in your piece that 2/3 of the cities surveyed in this Lancet 2020 study say that they expect climate change to be a compromising factor, a serious one, in their efforts to promulgate public health. And if they're already experiencing it now, it's just going to continue to exacerbate things.
Right. And before your viewers and listeners start tearing their hair out, I want to say there are solutions here. And I think that just in the way that doctors are facing some of the greatest challenges, they're also coming up with some of the best solutions. I mean, I have talked to doctors who are really trying to band together to create a comprehensive network of, climate conscious doctors who are not just educating patients about climate change, but also becoming more aware and tweaking their practices to accommodate rising temperatures, climate-driven diseases, other impacts of climate change. So there's a lot going on that at least makes me hopeful, and I think it should make you hopeful too. It's having doctors thinking about this issue is a really cool thing. They are very, very practical, and they put in great solutions that can be scaled up.
Well, I appreciate the note of optimism to end on there. The piece is called "From Samoa to the East Coast: Doctors are Diagnosing and Treating Climate Change." Zoya Teirstein, everybody check out Grist magazine, and we will put a link to your piece in the description of this podcast. And wherever you're listening to this or watching this, thanks so much, Zoya. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emma.
All right, guys. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up the first hour of this program, head into the fun half. We will take your calls. We will read your IMs. We will do some clips. A reminder that on Monday, we will be celebrating Michael Brooks's 40th birthday. That his birthday is on the 13th, right? But we'll be celebrating it. That's a Sunday. So on the 14th, on Monday, we'll be doing a special remembering Michael. Tune in for that. It'll be a great show. And Sam is out tomorrow, but yes, we'll be doing that episode on Monday. On ESPN, we spoke about the right-wing jubilation over the U.S. women's national team's loss, the Patriots over there. We gave some picks for rookie sleepers or rookies who could have huge years in fantasy-wise, as well as some other stories, youtube.com/ESPN show. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Yeah, Left Reckoning, we had a controversial discussion with Caleb Brooks about degrowth, which David Griscom is busy litigating on Twitter. Check that out. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning, where I also go into Jimmy Dore talking about young climate activists and some other stuff. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning to hear the postgame.
All right. Do we have Binder or Brandon? We have Brandon. We have Brandon. Soon. Hello? Hello, I hear you.
There you go.
There you are.
Hear me?
I just didn't see you. There you are. Hello, Brandon.
Hello, Emma.
What's happening over on the discourse?
I wasn't sure if we were live there, but actually we do have an episode up for you, or we will rather once we're done recording here, or rather streaming here. We talk about Trump's newest indictments, the lasting effect of Trump on the Republican Party and their branding, and what to look forward to as we sort of do the slow march into the climate apocalypse. So real full episode.
Awesome. All right. We will see Binder in the fun half, but check out Doomed and Scam Economy. The number is 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous, you're a little bit upset, you're riled up.
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
That's some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457-238. 56, 27, 1/2, 5 eighths, 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy!
Dance, dance, dance.
Ooh.
Rand Paul. I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up. Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up.
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
We are back. We are back, and now we are joined by Matt Binder, who has a tan.
I do, I guess, right? I guess
Yeah.
it's visible. Yeah.
50 Shades Darker.
Tan.
Yeah,
That's the dream.
I was down in Mexico for a wedding of a cousin, and it was a lot of fun. Got to left the area, snuck away, and took my kids to a lucha libre show, like a legit lucha libre experience. So that was
How
fun.
was it?
I had a good time. Yeah.
How was it?
It was a lot of fun. It was really good.
Oh, cool. All right. Well,
I have to say, I still have like vertigo from like this boat ride we took.